Hey guys, tonight we begin with a moment frozen in time. A moment so violent, so incomprehensible, that even those who lived through it couldn't explain what hit them. It's 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986. You're standing in the control room of Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The fluorescent lights above hum like insects. Everyone's tired, irritable, trying to finish one last safety test before sunrise. The numbers on the control panels are starting to do weird things, but no one dares pull the plug. Orders are orders. Then it happens. The floor jumps, not shakes jumps. A thunderclap echoes from beneath, and before you can speak, the 1,000-ton reactor lid has been launched into the air like a coin flicked by a god. You don't know this yet, but your reactor has gone prompt critical, an unholy surge of energy that no system on Earth was designed to handle. The core has just torn itself apart in under a second. Red-hot graphite chunks fly through the ceiling. Pipes scream. Metal hisses. You smell burning concrete, ozone, something chemical. Something wrong. You run toward the hallway, but there's a man stumbling toward you. His face is already blistering. His white uniform is speckled with black dots. No, not dirt. Radiation. Burns. He's muttering something about a fire in the reactor. But how can that be? The reactor is sealed. Except now. It isn't. Outside, the firemen arrive, pulling hoses and scaling ladders like it's just another warehouse blaze. Only this fire isn't just flame. It's invisible beams of X-rays, neutrons, alpha particles crawling up their skin and into their bones. They don't feel it yet, but the clock is ticking. Their insides are already unspooling. Meanwhile, you and the others are trying to make sense of the blinking alarms. The dosimeters, those devices meant to tell you how much radiation you've been exposed to, are maxing out. Not because they're detecting too much, but because they weren't designed to measure anything this high. One of them reads 3.6. Rent-in, but that's just the upper limit. The real number is closer to 30,000. People are vomiting. Eyes are watering. Not from smoke, but from cell death. Someone screams that their tongue feels like it's swelling. Another man falls to his knees and starts tearing off his shirt. His skin is sloughing off like wet paper. Then you realize something. Even worse, the reactor isn't just destroyed, it's open. Wide open. The very core of a nuclear heart, now exposed to the air, exhaling poison into the sky. Uranium fuel rods have burst. Graphite is on fire. Radioactive isotopes are being sucked upward by the heat, like ghosts escaping a bottle. By the time the emergency crew manages to gather, most of them are already doomed. They're told to fetch water, sand, or on anything to smother the beast. But the more they try to kill it, the more it breathes. And while this chaos unfolds inside the plant, the outside world remains asleep. Pripyat, just 2 miles away, is quiet. People are dreaming in their beds. Children curled up in blankets, lovers whispering in kitchens. They have no idea that one of the deadliest industrial accidents in human history is unfolding just up the road. Back in the plant, someone tries to take charge. Maybe it's the shift chief. Maybe it's a technician who still believes the readings are just a glitch. They send 2 men, Valerie and Boris, into the reactor building itself to inspect the core. They don't find a core. All they see is a pile of fire and blackened steel. Heat waves shimmer through the mangled skeleton of what used to be a controlled system. The blue glow, what physicists call Cherenkov radiation, is haunting, beautiful, deadly. The men disappear into the haze. One of them never makes it back. And just when it seems like the worst has happened, a second explosion rips through the building. This one sends graphite chunks flying like shrapnel. One chunk lands next to a fireman. He picks it up. and drops it immediately. His gloves have fused to his palms. His hand will need to be amputated if he survives long enough for surgery. Inside, all systems are in failure. Steam pressure is building in the backup systems. Alarms are now meaningless. There's no cooling water, no emergency shutdown, no hope. At this point, Reactor 4 is no longer a reactor. It's a volcano made of uranium and madness, spewing death into the atmosphere. And the people inside are just collateral, untrained, unprotected, and totally expendable. But what caused the reactor to explode in the first place? Who decided to run a safety test that turned a nuclear plant into a furnace? To understand how this nightmare even started, we need to talk about the firefighters. They had no idea what they were walking into. When the explosion lit up the sky over Chernobyl, the first to respond were the local fire brigades from Pripyat and surrounding areas. These were regular men, young, underpaid, overworked, and loyal to the Soviet system. They'd faced chemical fires, electrical blazes, the occasional industrial accident. But nothing like this. You arrive with your engine just minutes after. The call comes in. No one says the word radiation. It's just another blaze. They tell you something about a hydrogen line catching fire. You look up and see a reddish glow rising above Reactor 4. It doesn't look like any fire you've ever seen. It's blue at the center. There's a strange taste in your mouth, like metal, like batteries. The chief barks orders. You pull hoses. You scale ladders. You don't ask questions. But the moment your boots hit the roof, it's too late. The graphite from the exploded core is scattered all over. The black blocks look like harmless rubble. Someone kicks one aside. Another picks up a piece and tosses it off the edge. His glove begins to smoke. The material is superheated and saturated with gamma radiation hot enough to cook a person from the inside out, and no one warned you. You aim your hose at the flames, but the water doesn't seem to do much. You hear popping sounds like fat in a frying pan. That's not the fire crackling. That's the sound of radiation interacting with matter. Some men start coughing. One guy vomits over the side of the building and collapses. Another walks toward the stairs and falls halfway down. His skin has turned gray. You think it's ash. It's not. Down below, people are watching from their apartment balconies. The light from the plant has painted the sky an unnatural hue, and the brave silhouettes of firemen dashing across the scaffolding look like something out of a film. One woman even claps. Her baby is asleep in her arms. She has no idea what's falling from the sky. Inside your body, the damage has already begun. Your bone marrow, where blood cells are born, is under attack. Your skin's outer layer is dying faster than it can regenerate. The lining of your intestines is dissolving. But you don't know this yet. All you feel is the headache, a dry mouth, the shakes, and the heat, which doesn't make sense. It's a cool night. Another engine arrives. A second wave of firemen, still unaware of what happened to the first. They run past you with hoses, stretchers, extinguishers. Some make it to the roof. Most won't last more than a few hours after exposure. At first, they'll just look sunburned. Then the blisters will start. Then the bleeding from the gums. Then the organ failure. In the confusion, nobody can coordinate. Radio signals are jammed by the electromagnetic pulse of the blast. Nobody knows who's alive, who's missing, who's already dying. You're told to pull back after your second run. Your eyes are bloodshot. Your lips are cracked. You feel like you've been standing next to an open oven for hours. Someone mentions that your hair is falling out in clumps. You can't hold the hose anymore. Your hands are trembling too much. You're loaded onto a truck with 3 others and taken to the hospital. You lie on a stretcher while a nurse wipes your face. She touches your neck. Then her eyes widen. She pulls her hand back like she's been burned. Later, they'll burn your clothes, bury your equipment, scrub the floor where your stretcher sat. They'll even throw out the ambulance you rode in. And all this time, you're still asking, what kind of fire was that? The doctors don't tell you the truth. Some don't even know it. But the moment they see your white blood cell count, they understand. You've been dosed with radiation levels high enough to make your organs start melting. They'll keep you comfortable. Morphine, IVs, a cold cloth on your head. But there's no cure. You'll swell. You'll burn from the inside out. And soon, you'll start hallucinating. Your wife comes to visit. They make her wear a lead vest. She kisses your forehead through a plastic shield. She's pregnant, but no one's told her yet what that means for the baby. In a few days, you'll be unrecognizable. Your skin will turn dark and shiny. Your eyes will sink into your skull. The doctors will tell your family you're stable, just to buy them a little more time with you. But you'll be gone before the week is over. You were one of the first. And the worst part is, you were brave. You showed up. You fought the fire. You didn't run. And still, they never told you the truth. But the fire was just the beginning. The air around the plant had become something else entirely. And the next people to suffer didn't even know they were breathing in death. You step outside in the early morning hours, stretch your arms, and breathe in the cool air. It's oddly still quiet in that eerie, unnatural way. The sky is painted in a faint purple haze. It doesn't smell like smoke. It doesn't smell like anything. But something's wrong. And the worst part? You can't tell what. You go about your morning like any other. You pack your lunch. You walk your child to school. You wave at your neighbors, who are also enjoying the early April breeze. The birds are quieter than usual. Your skin feels a little itchy, but the air seems clean. What no one knows is that this air is a killer. It isn't smoke that's drifting through the trees of Pripyat. It's not dust or mist or fog. It's radioactive fallout cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90 particles so small you can't see them, and so dangerous that they cling to your lungs, bones, and thyroid like a curse. You've never heard of these elements. But now they're inside you. The air lies to you. There are no signs, no warnings. The government hasn't made an announcement. Schools are open. Buses are running. Factories are operating. People are sunbathing on rooftops. Meanwhile, the invisible poisons swirl through every open window. And unlike smoke, radiation doesn't tickle your throat or sting your eyes. You breathe it in without knowing. You bring it home on your shoes, on your coat, in your hair. You hold your baby, kiss their forehead, make them breakfast, and you're already glowing. The entire town is bathed in a radioactive fog, and no one's done a thing about it. Radiation, in its purest form, doesn't feel like anything at first. But the damage begins the moment it enters your body. It shoots through cells like microscopic bullets. It tears apart DNA. Some cells die. Others mutate. Your body tries to fix itself, but it can't keep up. And the more you breathe, the more you break. That metallic taste people start noticing, that's not in your head. It's the sign that your nerve endings are already being affected. The nausea, the headaches, the sudden urge to vomit, those are your organs signaling that they're under attack. You head to work at the chemical plant, unaware that the ventilation system is pumping in contaminated air. Others walk into the hospital with minor complaints, not realizing the walls themselves are now radioactive. A young girl licks a melting popsicle. A teenage boy sprays his hair before school. A mother opens her window to let in the breeze. Every one of them is breathing in tiny doses of destruction. The danger isn't just in the lungs. Iodine-131, locks onto your thyroid like a magnet. It's especially deadly for children, whose growing bodies absorb it even faster. But the state didn't hand out iodine tablets. There was no distribution of protective masks, because officially nothing had happened. The lie was part of the system. Even as hospital workers began noticing patterns, skin rashes, sudden fevers, vomiting, fatigue, no official word came. The instruments they used to detect radiation had already maxed out. A local technician had to use a borrowed Western Geiger counter just to confirm the obvious. The readings were off the charts. But by then, it was too late. And here's the irony. The people who stayed indoors were no safer. Radiation settled on rooftops. It drifted through air ducts. It landed on gardens, laundry lines, food markets. When you opened the refrigerator to get milk, it was already contaminated. When you took off your coat, you shed radioactive dust into the carpet. The government would eventually distribute pamphlets that read, "Wash vegetables thoroughly." But how do you wash out atoms? At the hospital, patients kept arriving. Firemen from the blast, plant workers, even children. One doctor reportedly collapsed after handling too many irradiated victims without any protection. The air in the A was so contaminated, nurses were getting sick just from working double shifts. And yet, no one evacuated the town. Pripyat's 50,000 residents were told to carry on as usual. The idea was to avoid panic. But what the authorities were really afraid of was being embarrassed. Admitting something had gone wrong at Chernobyl meant admitting a failure of Soviet technology, Soviet leadership, and Soviet pride. So instead, they told the public that everything was under control. But the air never lies. It doesn't care about politics. People started coughing up blood. Skin turned pale. Kids developed ulcers. Hair began falling out. And all across the town, birds fell from the sky. There was a man walking home from his night shift that morning who later said, "It felt like the world was holding its breath." He didn't realize it was already too late. By the time the truth came out, the air had already done its job. But while the skies poisoned quietly, the officials spoke even quieter. And the real cover-up was only just beginning. You flip on the radio, classical music, nothing else. You switch channels, more music. No announcements, no alarms, not even a weather update. The sky's still off color. The birds are still gone. Your neighbor hasn't come home from his shift. At the plant, and your skin feels like it's sunburned, even though it's barely spring. You go to work anyway. At the bus stop, someone mutters, "Something happened," but no one knows what. A woman in a factory uniform whispers, "They say the reactor caught fire." Someone else shakes their head. "It's just rumors." We would have heard something by now, but you won't hear anything. Not from the news, not from the radio, not from the loudspeakers that used to play party slogans every morning. The silence is the most Soviet thing of all. At the very top, the party knows. The Ministry of Energy knows. The local KGB office definitely knows. But they're waiting for permission to speak. And even then, it has to come from higher, maybe, even from Gorbachev himself. In the Soviet Union, saying the wrong thing could ruin your career, your family, or your life. So instead of acting, they stall. They draft memos. They hold meetings. Meanwhile, the air is turning people into walking experiments. Pripyat is one of the most monitored cities in the USSR. It was built for elite nuclear workers. But even their radiation sensors cap out at maximum. The official report still says minor accident. The firemen who were evacuated too. Hospital No. 6 in Moscow are already dying, but their records are being rewritten to say thermal burns. Even inside the control rooms, the plant's senior managers insist that the reactor core is intact. They argue this for hours even, though graphite from the core is literally scattered around the site and glowing in the night like cursed charcoal. Denial isn't just a reflex, it's policy. And while all this is happening, the school day begins. Thousands of children fill the classrooms of Pripyat. They sing the national anthem. They recite poems to Lenin. They draw pictures of rockets and wheat fields. No one tells them to stay home. No one hands out iodine tablets. The windows are open. Fallout settles on the desks like invisible snow. That same day, officials begin preparing for May Day celebrations. They send out posters, marching banners, red flags. In Kiev, plans for parades continue as if nothing happened, because if they cancel, people will ask questions. And questions are dangerous. But here's where the illusion cracks. A Swedish nuclear power plant, nearly 1,000 kilometers away, starts picking up radiation spikes. Their workers are setting off alarms just by walking into the facility. At first, they think they have a leak. But the readings are too high, and they're coming from outside. After careful analysis, Swedish scientists trace the wind patterns back east to the forests of northern Ukraine. They go public. That's when the Soviet government finally reacts. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The world already knows. And yet, even then, the announcement is vague. The Soviet news agency issues a single line. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Measures are being taken. That's it. No numbers. No names. No evacuation order. Just 6 words, designed to say everything and nothing. It's like being told your house is on fire, but don't worry, someone's thinking about doing something. Inside hospitals, the truth can't be hidden anymore. Nurses collapse. Doctors demand protective gear. Patients arrive glowing red and vomiting. Some are hallucinating. One young fireman tries to climb out of bed, his lips cracked, his eyes bleeding, muttering, "It's burning." Inside, and still, the TV shows ballet reruns. The people living outside Pripyat, farmers, drivers, school teachers, don't know if they should be concerned. No one's handing out masks. No one's explaining how to scrub radioactive dust from vegetables. And when they call for information, they're told the phone lines are down. They're not. They're being monitored. The lies stretch further. Government agents show up in protective suits. They walk through schools with Geiger counters, but tell the teachers it's just a drill. Meanwhile, the instruments are screaming. One classroom is so hot with radiation, they shut it down on the spot without telling the parents why. At the plant itself, a new team is brought in. They're told the reactor must be cooled with water. When they get there, they realize there's no reactor left, just a hole full of fire and glowing death. But no one updates the orders. You do what you're told, even when it kills you. Meanwhile, abroad, journalists are catching wind of the disaster. Reports flood in. Nuclear accident in Soviet Union. Cloud of radioactive material over Europe. Western scientists begin estimating casualties, and those estimates are terrifying. But inside the USSR, you're told to keep calm. Trust the party. Do your job. You go home that night and wash your hands 5 times. You throw away your coat. You hug your child and try not to cry, because you know something's wrong. And you know they're lying. But you don't know yet that the city is about to be evacuated, and you have no idea how late that evacuation will come. It should have happened the moment Reactor 4 blew. It should have happened when the firemen started coughing blood. It should have happened when the birds stopped chirping, when the grass turned gray, when people walking home from night shift said the sky tasted like metal. But it didn't. Pripyat, population 50,000, was still wide awake the day after the explosion. The schools were open. The trams were running. People went shopping. They lined up at bakeries. They took their kids to the park. It wasn't until 36 hours later, a day and a half, that they were told to leave. And even then, the lie continued. You hear the message through the apartment loudspeakers. A calm, slow voice. Comrades, due to an unfavorable radioactive situation, a temporary evacuation is required. Temporary. That's what they said. You're told to pack lightly. A suitcase. Important documents. 2 days' worth of clothes. Pets are to be left behind. You'll be back in 3 days, they say, so you pack what you can. A family photo. Your child's favorite toy. You pour the soup out of the pot and put it in the fridge. You tie up your dog, just in case it gets restless. You leave the laundry drying on the balcony. And then you board the bus. There are hundreds of them. Rows and rows of blue and yellow buses lined up at every main street and corner of Pripyat. You're herded in with neighbors, co-workers, strangers. Soldiers with masks and dosimeters stand nearby, but they won't answer questions. Some of them are visibly nervous. One is visibly sick. The buses pull away, and you look back at your apartment building, the potted plants in the window, the bicycle leaning against the wall, the place where you learned to walk, fell in love, had your first fight. It shrinks behind you as the trees roll past, and you don't know it yet, but that was the last time you'll ever see your home. Not all buses go far. Some drive only 15 miles out, dropping people in nearby villages with just as much fallout. Others take evacuees deeper into Ukraine, Belarus, or even into Russia. But the instructions remain the same. Don't panic, don't talk to outsiders, and don't ask too many questions. But panic creeps in anyway. You hear rumors that the fire was bigger than they said, that the core exploded, that bodies are being buried in sealed caskets. One woman claims she saw trucks full of children taken away separately. Another man swears his brother was shot trying to leave the area early. No one knows what's true, but everyone knows something's very wrong. Back in Pripyat, the city begins to rot. Milk sours in fridges. Aquariums evaporate. Radios peep, playing for no one. Dogs howl on balconies. Some homes catch fire from stove burners left on. Looters sneak in, some wearing gas masks, others wearing nothing at all. The radiation doesn't stop for anyone. The pets left behind, cats, dogs, birds, don't understand what happened. They wait. Days pass. They grow weak, hungry. Some turn feral. Others never even try. Later, soldiers will be sent in with rifles to handle the animals, and no one will ever be allowed to return. The evacuation was sold as temporary because it had to be. If they had said the truth, leave now forever, there would have been panic. And panic was more dangerous in the minds of the officials than radiation. So even as people coughed, even as infants developed fevers, even as the air burned your throat and made your teeth ache, they waited. 36 hours. Think about that. 36 hours of radiation raining down like invisible snowflakes. 36 hours of children rolling in the grass. 36 hours of people hanging laundry, sipping tea by open windows, breathing in particles that would change their blood. By the time the last bus pulled away from Pripyat, the damage had already been done. And for those who stayed behind, the workers, the soldiers, the plant staff, the nightmare was just getting started. They would become part of the next phase in the state's plan, the cleanup. They would be called liquidators, and their jobs would make everything you've just heard sound like a vacation. The name made it sound technical, clinical, even. Liquidator, like someone in a lab coat turning dials. But in reality, it meant something far more brutal. You were drafted, not asked. One day you're repairing telephone lines, or driving a delivery truck, or studying engineering at university. The next, you're on a train with a duffel bag, headed toward a glowing crater in northern Ukraine. No explanation, just a government order. You are now part of the cleanup. The job? Simple on paper. Clear radioactive debris from the site. Dig trenches. Lay concrete. Seal what can be sealed. Destroy what can't. Report to duty. Obey instructions. No complaints. Except no one really knew what they were doing. And no one told you what you were walking into. The suits they gave you were cheap. Sometimes just hospital scrubs. Sometimes a lead vest that weighed more than a child. The boots didn't fit. The gloves were full of holes. Your mask fogged up every few seconds, so you often worked with it pulled down. You were told to avoid hot spots, but there were. No maps, just patches of land that made your Geiger counter scream. If it buzzed too fast, you were supposed to move. But by the time it buzzed, it was already too late. Your shift was timed to the second. 90 seconds. That's how long some of you had to work on the roof of Reactor 3 clearing chunks of graphite from the blown core. You'd dash out, scoop rubble with a shovel, throw it off the edge into the pit, and run back before your skin started sizzling. It felt like punishment. It was punishment. The Soviets tried using robots first. They sent in remote-controlled machines, tank-like devices with arms, cameras, tools. But the radiation was too strong. The machines shut down after minutes. Their circuits fried, their tracks locked. Even the West German robot they borrowed melted after a single outing. So instead, they used biorobots. That meant each liquidator was told, you will work one time for 1 minute. But the reality was different. Some worked multiple shifts. Some stayed for hours. One man, ordered to weld a seam on a contaminated pipe, vomited into his mask while sparks danced off his visor. He was told to finish the job anyway. There were thousands of you. Military men, miners, engineers, farmers. Over 600,000 people would rotate through the zone in the months after the explosion. Some dug tunnels under the reactor. Some bulldozed entire villages. Some were told to scrape the topsoil off entire forests, roll it into barrels, and bury it underground. Radiation doesn't come with instructions. And you didn't just work. You lived in it. You ate in mess halls set up just outside the exclusion zone. You slept in tents made of canvas. You washed your hands with contaminated water. The food tasted strange. Some of the potatoes glowed faintly. The bread left a metallic film on your tongue. They gave you vodka. Not because it helped, but because it made you care less. Some men drank until they collapsed. Others drank because it was the only thing that masked the taste in their mouths. And the medals, yes, they gave out medals. Small bronze discs stamped with the year and the mission. For valor. For sacrifice. For liquidation efforts. They didn't mean much. Most of you didn't live long enough to wear them. What did the radiation actually do to your body? It attacked the cells that reproduce the fastest blood, skin, bone marrow. That's why your guns bled. That's why your skin peeled off in sheets. That's why you stopped growing new hair. You aged 10 years in one. Some of you had children later with birth defects. Others couldn't have children at all. And still, you kept going. One man shoveled debris until his teeth cracked from clenching his jaw. Another carried a friend off the roof after watching his nose start bleeding uncontrollably. A miner who helped dig a tunnel beneath the core naked because the heat was too much for clothes later died in his early 30s. The state thanked you, briefly, and denied that the radiation levels had been high, and accused some of you of exaggerating. Others were forgotten entirely, your names lost, your files misclassified. You weren't heroes to them. You were statistics. And yet, without you, The fire would have burned for months. The core would have melted into the water table. The explosion could have poisoned half of Europe. But the price? Unmeasurable. And while the liquidators were burning under the sun, something else was happening in the city you'd left behind. Something sadder. Smaller, but just as cruel. Because while you were being used like tools, the children of Pripyat were suffering in silence. You don't know what fallout is. No one taught you that word in school. You're 7 years old, and your biggest concern is finding your missing shoe before your mom yells again. But something's wrong. Your stomach hurts. Not the kind of hurt that comes after candy or too much running. This one is deep, warm, like something's glowing inside you. Your throat is dry. Your skin is itchy. You're sweating, but it's not hot. When you cough, your chest rattles. It feels like you've swallowed gravel. Your mother is worried, but she doesn't say it. She wraps you in a blanket and tells you it's a bug going around. The radio said everything's fine, but she's seen the men in uniforms walking through the neighborhood with strange equipment. She's seen the patches of dead grass, the dying, birds, the weird light that hangs in the air long after the sun's gone down. What she doesn't know, what none of you know, is that the cloud from Reactor 4 passed over your town 3 days ago. You were outside when it happened, playing, running, laughing, and you were breathing. Radiation doesn't always kill right away. Sometimes it waits, especially for children. Your body is still growing. Your cells divide faster. Your thyroid, the little gland in your neck that manages hormones, is like a sponge for iodine. And iodine 131 is one of the nastiest things riding the wind after Chernobyl blew. And guess what? There were no iodine pills, no protective gear, no warnings to stay indoors. In fact, you remember your teacher telling the class to go outside for fresh air. You picked dandelions in a field that was glowing at night. The sun didn't feel warm anymore. It felt sharp. It's not just you. In the weeks after the disaster, pediatric hospitals start to fill. Doctors are overwhelmed. Infants with fevers, toddlers with nosebleeds, kids vomiting for no reason. They try to diagnose it as the flu, or a seasonal bug, or nerves. But deep down, they know. Your hair starts falling out. In clumps, your gums bleed when you brush. You wake up with blood on your pillow. You start sleeping more sometimes for whole days. Your parents whisper in the kitchen when they think you're not listening. The word thyroid keeps coming up. So does cancer. Still, no one talks about the reactor. Your family doesn't want trouble. They don't want to be labeled complainers. In the USSR, to question the government is to question reality itself. So they lie to each other. She'll get better. He's just tired. It's nothing. Except it isn't. By the end of the year, childhood thyroid. Cancer cases spike dozens of times above normal. In some areas, the rates are 100 times higher than they were before. April 1986. Surgeons start removing thyroids from children barely old enough to walk. The scars become a badge jagged lines across soft necks. But the damage doesn't stop there. Some children begin to change. Their growth slows. Their teeth rot. Some develop developmental delays. Others are born to parents who lived downwind from Chernobyl, with limbs that don't work, with hearts that beat out of rhythm, with immune systems that barely function. The state denies everything. They say the rates are exaggerated. They say Western scientists are using scare tactics. They say there's no proof. But the children don't lie. They show up at hospitals in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia by the hundreds. Doctors start keeping their own private records, terrified that the truth will vanish like so many others. And then there are the mothers, women who were pregnant during the fallout. Many lost their babies in the first few weeks. Some gave birth to children who didn't survive a month. Others had babies who looked healthy at first, until the seizures started, or the tumors, or the inexplicable failures of organs no one could explain. And the most tragic part? It could have been prevented. If the evacuation had happened sooner. If iodine pills had been distributed. If people had simply been told to stay inside. If the truth had been shared instead of suppressed. But in a system built on silence, the children became collateral. And even decades later, they would still suffer. Because radiation doesn't just vanish. It lingers. It sinks into the soil, the water, the bodies of the smallest, most fragile people. And those children would grow up marked not by choice, not by action, but by breath. But there was something else survivors remember. Something they could taste. Something that never made sense until they realized it was the first sign of everything falling apart inside them. And that strange sensation would haunt them forever. You're walking home from your shift. The sky is pale. The wind is still. You run your tongue across your teeth. And then you stop. There it is again. That taste. Metal. It's faint at first. Like chewing on a coin. Or biting into tinfoil. But it's real. You ask your friend if they feel it too. And they nod. Yeah. They say, tastes like a battery exploded in my mouth. No one understands what it means. It doesn't hurt. It's just strange. But it stays. It lingers. And it's not going away. That metallic taste would become one of the eeriest and most unforgettable symptoms reported by people who were near Reactor 4 in the hours and days after the explosion. Firefighters, plant workers, soldiers, nurses, teachers, children. They all described it the same way, like blood, iron, electricity. And science has an answer, but it's not a comforting one. That taste is ionizing radiation, messing with your salivary glands and nerve endings. When your mouth starts picking up on that tinny, battery-like flavor, it's a sign that the particles, tearing through your body, have already started damaging the tissue in your tongue and throat. You're not imagining it. You're tasting your own decay in slow motion. Some people thought it was just nerves. Others thought it came from dust in the air. But those who had worked near the core on the roof, in the halls, even briefly inside the control room, knew better. They had swallowed something they couldn't spit out. And that wasn't the only symptom. Along with the taste came the headaches, blinding, pulsing, like your skull was trying to grow 2 sizes bigger. Then the nausea. You'd suddenly feel like your guts had been tied in a knot. And no matter how many times you threw up, the pressure didn't go away. Then your skin. At first, it looked red, sunburned, maybe irritated. But then came the burning. Not hot like fire hot, like an itch you can't scratch, because the pain is beneath the skin. Then the color changed. Patches turned purple. Others blistered. You'd wake up with fluid-soaked sheets. One man said it felt like he was boiling from the inside out. You still remember the first time you coughed blood. It wasn't traumatic, just a few specks on your toothbrush. But then it started happening more often. Little red dots on your pillow, in your handkerchief, in your food. Doctors began seeing patterns. They'd check vitals, take blood samples, and the results were terrifying. White blood cell counts were collapsing. Platelets gone. Bone marrow barely functioning. And the patients didn't even look sick yet. They called it ARS, acute radiation syndrome. The name doesn't capture the horror. It sounds technical, but living it? That was something else. First your mouth goes metallic. Then your stomach turns. Then the blood starts leaking out of places it shouldn't. Your skin sloughs. Your hair falls out. You get ulcers in your throat that make swallowing feel like chewing glass. And all of this could happen in days or hours, depending on how close you were to the source. The firemen who stood on the roof? Hours. The control room staff who ran back inside to save equipment? A few days. The helicopter crews who flew directly over the burning core? Sometimes minutes. And the metallic taste was always the first warning. For survivors, that taste never left their memory. Some even claimed to still feel it years later, ghost flavors locked into the brain like trauma. Others couldn't eat certain foods again. Anything with coins, iron pans, or blood sausage triggered flashbacks. It wasn't PTSD in the traditional sense. It was something stranger. Like their bodies remembered being poisoned, even if their minds tried to forget. You might think this is rare, but thousands of people reported the same thing. People from different regions, different languages, different jobs, all describing the same silent symptom from the same invisible enemy. And for those who didn't notice it at the time, they found out the hard way later. The ones who ignored the taste ended up in Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, the facility where high-dose radiation victims were brought. They arrived stable, some even joked with the nurses. But over the course of a week, they decayed in real time. One man's tongue swelled until he couldn't breathe. Another lost the skin on his feet just by standing. A young soldier developed open sores across his chest. And they all remembered tasting that same metallic signal, like a warning bell in their mouths. But no one had told them what it meant. No one said, "Spit that out." No one said, "Get underground." No one said, "Run." Because in the Soviet system, the first instinct was not to protect, but to control. Silence was safer than the truth. Calm was more valuable than accuracy. And pride was more important than human life. So the air stayed quiet, and the taste stayed in your mouth. But long before the bodies piled up, something else had to be addressed. Because the animals didn't evacuate. They couldn't pack bags. They couldn't understand danger. And what happened to them was even darker. They waited at the gates, tails wagging, ears perked up, whining softly. The dogs didn't know that their owners weren't coming back. They didn't understand what an evacuation was. They just waited outside apartments, on stairwells, beside the swings in the park. Some followed the buses. Some chased them for miles, and then gave up. In the hours and days after Pripyat was evacuated, the town went still, but it wasn't empty. Thousands of animals remained, mostly dogs and cats. Family pets, street strays. A few had collars, some had names. Most were friendly. They approached soldiers and liquidators with wagging tails, hoping for food, for affection, for something familiar. They didn't get it, because within days of the evacuation, the Soviet army issued new orders. Eliminate all animals within. The zone, not relocate, not rescue, eliminate. The reasoning was cold and clinical. Animals were covered in radioactive dust, especially the ones that had rolled in the ash or slept near the power plant. Their fur held onto fallout like Velcro. Letting them wander posed a risk of further contamination, especially if they escaped the zone. So soldiers were sent in with guns. Not soldiers trained in animal control, regular conscripts. 18, 19 years old. Many had never fired a weapon outside training. And now they were told to go door to door, room to room, street to street, and shoot everything that moved. They called it cleaning duty, but it was something else. You walk into an empty apartment, a bowl still on the floor, a blanket by the radiator. A dog looks up at you. It doesn't growl. It doesn't run. It wags its tail. You raise your rifle. You hesitate. The lieutenant behind you barks. Shoot. Some couldn't do it. Others did reluctantly. And some got used to it. They joked. To cope, gave the animals nicknames. Played cards between assignments. Then went back out and did it again. The dogs were smart. They started hiding. They learned to run when they heard footsteps. Some burrowed into basements. Others vanished into the woods. But the soldiers followed. They were told to shoot anything with fur, anything that breathed. Cats, pigeons, rabbits. There were even reports of zoo animals being put down. They burned the bodies, piled them in trenches, poured chemicals over them, set them on fire. Because the fear wasn't just about contamination. It was about visibility. The image of animals roaming an abandoned city didn't fit the narrative of orderly evacuation. It was a loose thread that had to be cut. And yet, they didn't get them all. Some animals survived. Packs of dogs formed in the ruins. Cats thrived in abandoned buildings. Wild boar and wolves, once afraid of people, returned to hunt in the quiet streets. Nature took back the zone faster than anyone expected. But the dogs? They lingered at the edges, friendly, hungry, always hoping the people would come back. And decades later, they did. Scientists, tourists, documentary crews. They found the descendants of those abandoned pets lean, wary, radioactive in trace amounts, but still wagging their tails, still looking for scraps, still loyal to people who had left generations ago, and some were even adopted. A few lucky strays, born years after the disaster, were taken in by international animal groups. After testing and quarantine, they were flown out of Ukraine and rehomed. They lived in houses again, sat on couches, licked children's faces. They became symbols not of tragedy, but survival. But for most, that never happened. For most, Chernobyl was the end. Not because of radiation, not because of starvation, but because they were loved and then exterminated. The soldiers never forgot it. Many later spoke about it with more pain than they spoke about radiation. They could handle the danger, the filth, the nausea, but not that. Not the eyes of a creature that trusted them just before they pulled the trigger. And that was just the animals. The humans were still being used like tools, especially the ones assigned to the most dangerous task of all, clearing the reactor roof. And that job was never meant for humans in the first place. It was supposed to be done by machines. After all, the roof of Reactor 3 was littered with chunks of graphite pieces of the core from Reactor 4, blown sky high and scattered like volcanic gravel. These fragments were burning hot with radiation. Some were still smoking. Standing next to one for even a minute meant your body would absorb a lifetime's worth of exposure. So they sent in the robots first, Soviet machines, East German crawler units, remote-controlled arms designed to scoop the deadly debris off the rooftop and dump it into the wreckage below. In theory, this was the perfect plan. The robots would clean up what no human could touch. But there was a problem. The radiation was so intense it fried their circuits. Even lead shielding wasn't enough. Their wiring melted. Their batteries died. The guidance systems went blind. Some machines just stopped. Others went berserk, spinning in place, ramming walls, flinging radioactive debris at random. A few simply drove off the roof and fell into the wreckage below. The technology failed. And so the order came down, send in the biorobots. That was the nickname given to the human replacements. Men, mostly soldiers, mostly young, armed with shovels, wearing suits made of fabric, not lead, told to run onto the rooftop, scoop debris into the pit, and run back. Each man was allowed 90 seconds. That was the limit. Beyond that, the dosage would be too high. You'd start to feel it, the tingling in your teeth, the pounding in your head, the heat that wasn't heat, but cellular destruction. You're one of them now. You climb a narrow stairwell and emerge onto the rooftop. The sky is gray. The concrete is blackened. You're handed a shovel. There's a white line painted on the floor. Your orders. Stay between the lines. Don't step near the graphite. Dump your load quickly and get out. The whistle blows, you run. Your boots slap against the rooftop. You see the graphite jagged alien humming like it's alive. You scoop it into a lead-lined bucket. You don't look at it. You don't breathe. You dump the load and sprint back. Behind you, another man runs past, his face pale, his movements robotic. Down the stairwell, a medic scans you with a dosimeter. It's redlining. Your exposure for that day is done. You're sent to a decontamination tent, stripped, scrubbed, given a shot of something that probably doesn't work. Then they hand you a certificate and a meal. Some men are done after one shift. Others are sent back the next day. No one tells you how much radiation you actually received. The officials keep the numbers vague. The instruments are unreliable. The data is incomplete. But everyone feels it. The fatigue, the dizziness, the nausea that rolls in hours later. You hear stories about someone collapsing in the shower, about another guy who started bleeding from his ears. Still, you go back, because if you don't, someone else will. And maybe they'll last even less time than you did. Some men begin competing, who can carry more graphite, who can run faster, who can last longer. It's toxic bravado, but it helps pass the fear. Others just break down. One man freezes at the top of the stairs and refuses to move. Another collapses mid-run. They carry him down and don't say a word. They build a wall to block the worst. Radiation from the exploded core. They call it the Moscow Wall. Just a sheet of concrete and metal meant to shield the workers from the deadliest line of fire. It helps a little, but not enough. No one is filming this. No one is writing down names. This isn't heroism. It's triage. You're being used to hold back a firestorm with your bare hands. By the end of the week, the roof is mostly cleared. The graphite chunks are dumped back into the core. The radiation is still leaking, still pulsing, still unstoppable. But at least the rooftop is empty. At least for now. And when your shift is done, you're given a pin, a certificate, sometimes a handshake. But the real reward comes later if you're lucky enough to still have working organs. Many of the biorobots suffered in silence. They weren't told the risks. They weren't given options. They were praised on paper, then forgotten in practice. But years later, when their bones cracked too early, when their teeth fell out, when their children were born with strange anomalies, they remembered. And they remembered the roof. That blackened hellscape where machines failed and humans were thrown in to die by the minute. But the graphite wasn't the only thing poisoning the land. Because just beyond the plant, hidden behind a curtain of red trees, an entire forest had silently collapsed. And what happened there was so surreal, it looked like something from another planet. You'd think the trees would be fine. After all, they're tough. They bend in the wind, freeze through winter, and spring back every year with new leaves. They don't breathe air like we do. They don't have lungs to burn. So when radiation sweeps through a pine forest, you might expect the damage to be subtle, invisible, delayed, but not this time. This time, it was instant. Within hours of the explosion at Reactor 4, the pine trees downwind, just a few hundred meters away, began to change. Their green needles turned brown, then orange, then rust red. Not over days or weeks, overnight. By the next morning, the entire forest looked scorched from above, like it had been dipped in fire and frozen in place. But there were no flames, no soot, no smoke, just silence. That's why they started calling it the Red Forest. It didn't take long for people to realize what had happened. Those trees hadn't just died. They'd been irradiated beyond recognition. The radioactive plume from the reactor had passed, directly over the forest canopy, bombarding the cells in the needles and bark. It wasn't a slow decay, it was obliteration. On a microscopic level, the very building blocks of the trees had been scrambled. And the trees weren't the only victims. Beneath the canopy, the moss blackened, the mushroom shriveled, insects vanished. Birds flew in and never flew out. Small mammals disappeared. In the following weeks, even the decomposition process seemed to stop. Bacteria in the soil had been killed too. Nature had pressed pause. And the radiation didn't stay put. It didn't sink harmlessly into the ground. Wind kicked up the dust. Rain moved it downstream. Animals that survived carried it on their fur. The red forest became a source of secondary contamination, a kind of glowing reservoir that leaked death into everything nearby. So the authorities made a decision. Bulldoze it. You were part of that crew. They handed you a tractor, a thin mask, a shovel, and they told you to level the forest, cut it down, push it into trenches, bury it deep, and do it fast. You thought it would be just another job. But the second your blade touched the bark, you knew something was wrong. The trees didn't fall right. The wood was soft, spongy, hollowed. The trunks cracked open to reveal rot and ash. Some oozed sap that smelled sharp, like chemicals. Others disintegrated before they hit the ground. And the soil wasn't soil anymore. It was thick, dense, almost greasy, like it had absorbed too much of something it couldn't digest. Your boots stuck in it like glue. Your Geiger counter screamed so loudly you had to tape it down just to get through your shift. Still, you kept working, because no one said stop, because you were told to trust the readings, because the party said it was safe enough with limited exposure, and you wanted to believe that, but your body disagreed. Within days, your hands began to peel, your nails cracked, your eyes stung like you'd been swimming in bleach. The nausea returned, and that metallic taste, that awful signal sat in the back of your throat like a reminder. Some men passed out. Others had nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. One collapsed after just 30 minutes in the zone. They took him away on a stretcher, wrapped in foil. The bulldozing continued. By the time the job was done, the red forest had been flattened and buried under meters of dirt. Trees, roots, mushrooms, insects, soil, everything sealed underground, in mass graves. But it didn't end there. The radiation didn't die. It just hid. And years later, when researchers returned to the site, they made a discovery that stunned everyone. Life had come back. Birds nested in the stumps. Wolves hunted in the brush. Wild horses roamed the grasses. Trees had regrown. Animals that humans had driven away for centuries now moved freely among the ruins. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a warning. The red forest is still one of the most radioactive places on Earth. The creatures living there are changed, some visibly, some subtly. Many carry mutations. Some don't survive long. Others thrive despite the odds, because nature, unlike humans, doesn't lie. It doesn't need politics. It doesn't need cover-ups. It simply adapts or dies. And in the shadows of the trees, that turned red and died in silence. Chernobyl became something else. Not just a disaster site, not just a warning, but a living monument to what happens when you try to silence the truth. But while forests were bulldozed, something even stranger was happening in the kitchens and grocery stores across the USSR. Because the food that had been exposed wasn't thrown away. It was fed to people, especially the ones who couldn't. Say no. You're in line at the market. The shelves look emptier than usual. The meat is grayish. The milk tastes funny. But you shrug it off. It's the USSR food has always been weird. What you don't know is that what you're about to buy is radioactive. And not just a little. In the days and weeks after the explosion, rain clouds carried radioactive isotopes across hundreds of kilometers. They settled into the soil. They coated the leaves of cabbage fields. They soaked into rivers and lakes. They dusted wheat stalks and seeped into cow pastures. But the state wasn't about to waste a good harvest. Instead of discarding contaminated food, they rerouted it. Crops from irradiated zones were quietly shipped elsewhere. Milk from cows grazing in the fallout was mixed with cleaner batches and delivered to schools. Berries from contaminated woods were sent to canneries. Livestock were butchered and labeled as fit for consumption, even when their bones clicked Geiger counters like castanets. Some of this food ended up in Moscow, some in Leningrad, but a disturbing amount was redirected to orphanages, hospitals, prisons, and remote towns places where people had little power to complain and even less chance of being heard. And the people who received it? They ate it. They fed it to their children. They drank it without question. You open a carton of milk and pour it into your child's cereal. You don't know that the cow that produced it had radioactive iodine pooled in her udder. You don't know that every sip delivers microdoses of cancer into your child's thyroid. No one told you, because to destroy the food would have meant acknowledging the scale of the disaster. It would have meant losing money, losing face, creating panic, so they covered it up. There are stories confirmed later of food inspectors being told to falsify records. Geiger readings were rewritten. Shipment logs were adjusted. One inspector who refused to approve a batch of irradiated beef was reassigned to a remote post in Siberia. Some refused to play along. In Belarus, a group of scientists discovered that school children were being served contaminated milk. They demanded the school switch to powdered milk until iodine levels dropped. The school complied quietly, and only for a while. Then, under pressure, they resumed using local supplies. It wasn't just milk. It was bread, potatoes, canned goods, even baby formula. Anything grown or processed in the affected regions carried risk. But the government insisted it was safe, because admitting otherwise would have unraveled everything. And the long-term cost? Staggering. Childhood thyroid cancer rates soared. Women who drank the milk while pregnant reported higher rates of miscarriage and birth defects. Men exposed to contaminated food saw their white blood cell counts drop and immune systems weaken. One mother fed her baby milk from a bottle for weeks after the disaster. Her child later developed a golf ball-sized tumor on her neck. The family was told it was genetic. Years later, they discovered half the children on their block had the same condition. The worst part? It didn't stop in 1986. The soil stayed tainted for years. Mushrooms, berries, and wild game staples of the countryside remained radioactive, but villagers kept eating them, not because they didn't care, but because they had no choice. There was no alternative. The government wasn't handing out clean food, and no one was going to relocate thousands of rural families. In some places, they set up clean zones with labeled goods. But the labels were fake, just paper shields hiding the rot underneath. You'd go to market and see apples from Belarus with shiny skins and a sign that read, "Certified safe." You'd bring them home, wash them, peel them, but the poison was inside, in the flesh, in the seeds. Decades later, scientists would still find elevated cesium levels in meat from wild boar, in berries, in honey, and in the bones of people who never even knew what a Röntgen was. Because radiation doesn't care about dates, or borders, or lies, and the ones who suffered most were the ones with no voice: children, the elderly, the poor, the sick. They didn't know what was happening to them. They just knew their food started tasting weird. that their joints hurt more, that their hair fell out faster, that the world felt thinner, more fragile. And all along, the trucks kept rolling, delivering death packed in tins, bottled in milk, jugs, stamped with official seals and signatures. But there were others who weren't so easily fooled. Others who flew directly into the heart of the reactor's plume. Pilots, volunteers, heroes. Some never landed, again in one piece. You're a pilot. You've flown through storms, through military drills. You've landed in fog thick enough to choke a flashlight. But you've never done anything like this. You've just been briefed. Fly over Reactor 4. The fire's still, burning. Smoke is pouring out of the exposed core. Radiation is rising in a plume that can be seen from space. But your job is simple: drop sand and boron into the inferno below. A mix designed to smother the fire and prevent another explosion. They hand you a flight suit. It's not lead-lined. They say the exposure will be limited. They say you'll be in and out. You climb into the chopper. It's a Mil-Me-8, a Soviet workhorse of a machine. You've flown this model hundreds of times. But today, the air feels heavy. The wind over the plant is erratic. Your dosimeter ticks before you even lift off. You ignore it. The sandbags are loaded, each weighing 40 to 80 kilograms. You and your crew hover over the smoldering reactor, lining up your drop. You can feel the heat rising, though you're hundreds of feet in the air. The smoke isn't just dark. It glows faintly, a color that doesn't make sense. You release the bags. Then you circle back. Another chopper goes up after you. Then another. Then another. One after the other, teams fly over the reactor, dumping thousands of tons of sand, clay, boron, lead, and dolomite. The idea is to bury the core under enough heavy material to stop the chain reaction. But the radiation is stronger than expected. The plume rising from Reactor 4 acts like a laser beam of gamma radiation. Pilots are flying directly through it. Their choppers are coated in radioactive particles. Their instruments malfunction mid-air. One crew radios in that their controls have gone sluggish. Another reports intense heat inside the cockpit, like flying through a furnace. Then it happens. A helicopter, hovering too close, clips a crane with its rotor. It spins out. There's no time to react. The craft flips, crashes directly into the reactor ruins, and explodes. Everyone on board is killed instantly. Footage of the crash is captured from a nearby building. It shows the rotor blade separating mid-spin, then silence. The video is never aired publicly in the USSR. And still, the missions continue. Pilots are rotated every few hours. Some collapse after just one flight. Nosebleeds, vomiting, disorientation. Others show no symptoms at first, but within days, their hair falls out, their skin reddens, their white blood cell counts drop like a stone. One pilot wrote in his journal, "The air was hot, like it wanted to peel the skin off my face. I still don't know how I'm alive." Another wrote, "We couldn't see the core, only the glow. I don't know what color that was. It didn't feel real. They weren't trained for this. These were search and rescue pilots, freight pilots, transport crews. None of them expected to fly directly into a nuclear furnace. But they did it. Anyway, dozens of missions. Hundreds of tons of material dropped, all by hand, in unstable air, under extreme conditions. Later, scientists would question whether the sand drops even helped. Some argued it made things worse trapping heat, raising the core temperature, increasing the risk of another explosion. But the state didn't pause to ask. The orders were clear. Do something. Do it fast. Look like you're in control. The pilots were caught in that desperation. When their missions ended, most were quietly dismissed. A few were hospitalized. One or two received medals, but most simply went home and waited. Some developed aggressive cancers. Some began losing memory. Some couldn't have children. Others had children who suffered from unexplained illnesses. And there were no answers. The records were incomplete. The government was evasive. Some documents were destroyed. Others were locked away. You only knew what you experienced and what you saw happen to the others. One pilot visited Chernobyl again, years later. He stood on the edge of the exclusion zone, watching the silent ruin. His eyes filled with tears, not because of nostalgia, but because he could still feel it on his skin, in his lungs, in the metallic taste that returned the moment the wind changed direction. He survived. Most didn't, and even those who did never fully returned, because you can't fly through a ghost and come back whole. And those who ordered the flights, the officials, the generals, well, they had their own problems. Because some of them were so close to the blast, they started to fall apart from the inside out. They wore suits. They gave speeches. They sat behind long tables with microphones and state flags. They told the world everything was under control. And then they started to glow. Not literally, but close enough. These were the party officials. The engineers, the bureaucrats who came to Chernobyl in the first 48 hours. Not to help, not to evacuate, not to heal, but to manage the narrative. You see, in the Soviet Union, truth was often considered dangerous, especially the kind that embarrassed the state. So when Reactor 4 exploded, their first instinct wasn't containment, it was control. They sent in deputy ministers, high-ranking military men, scientists with PhDs, and all of them walked through the ruins of the plant, stood on top of radioactive rubble, gave orders while standing next to steaming graphite, and did it all without protective gear. Because to wear a mask or suit might send the wrong message. To admit danger would be to admit failure. So they stood tall, hands clasped behind their backs, faces stern, cigarettes dangling from their lips. No masks, no meters. Just pride and denial. Some of them climbed onto the roof of the control room. One even walked to the edge of the blasted core to assess the damage personally. Others toured the fire zones, walked through the ash, patted firemen on the back with bare hands. They thought they were invincible. Or maybe they thought they had no choice. But radiation doesn't care about status. By the end of the week, symptoms began to show. One senior engineer, who had insisted on staying at the site day and night, collapsed during a meeting. He was sweating through his suit. His speech slurred. He couldn't stand. By the time they admitted him to the hospital, his skin was already peeling. Another party official started coughing up blood mid-interview. Cameras stopped rolling. He was rushed out of frame. One of the plant's managers, who denied for hours that the reactor had even exploded, developed massive internal burns. His bone marrow was practically gone. He died in agony, begging doctors to save his colleagues instead. They were given beds at Moscow's best hospital, Hospital No. 6, the one reserved for radiation victims. The sheets were changed constantly. Nurses wore triple gloves. Their clothing was destroyed after every shift. Some of the officials didn't even last a week. Their deaths were quiet. The funerals were private. Coffins sealed in zinc. And the records? Altered. The official causes were listed as cardiac arrest, complications from illness, or exhaustion. Anything but the truth. And yet, they kept coming. Other officials replaced the ones who fell. Inspectors from ministries, delegates from Kiev, observers from the Central Committee, all with clipboards, all taking notes, none wearing dosimeters. One general stood on the wreckage of the turbine hall, looked at the destruction, and said, "This will be fixed in a week." He died in 3. Another tried to stop the evacuation of Pripyat after the explosion. It would cause panic, he said. He later suffered seizures and memory loss. He didn't remember saying it. They lied to their people. Then they lied to the world. And then they started lying to themselves. Some claimed they felt fine, that the radiation was overhyped, that Western propaganda was to blame. One even joked, "I've eaten worse things in army kitchens." He was buried 6 months later. Others were more tragic. One official reportedly cried during his final hours, asking why no one told him the truth. But the truth had been available. The instruments were screaming. The science was clear. It had just been buried like so many others. Not all of them died. Some survived with chronic illnesses, nervous disorders, infertility, cancers that took years to develop. They spent the rest of their lives living in a quiet fog haunted by what they did, what they said, and what they covered up. But perhaps the most disturbing part? They never apologized. Even in death, the narrative held. The official line was, "A tragic accident, handled with bravery and resolve." The men who lied were painted as heroes. Statues were built. Ceremonies held. But the people closest to them knew the truth. They had melted inside. And while those at the top crumbled from radiation, the city they had fled was still there, still filled with toys on the floor, still echoing with laughter that had stopped mid-sentence, still waiting for someone to come back. Because Pripyat didn't die all at once. It lingered, a ghost city, trapped in amber. It looks like the kids just stepped outside for recess. The chairs are still pulled out at school desks. The chalkboard still has yesterday's lesson. A math book lies open, mid-equation. In the nursery, dolls sit in rows on cribs, their button, eyes staring into nothing. In the kitchen, a kettle sits on the stove, untouched. A half-eaten apple has browned and shriveled into a fossil. This is Pripyat, the ghost city. Once a thriving model town of the Soviet nuclear age, now a frozen time capsule of disaster. When the buses left and the fences went up, Pripyat became something few had ever seen. A fully evacuated metropolis. An entire city abandoned in a single day. 50,000 people simply vanished, leaving behind clothes, pets, dreams, and everything they thought they'd return to. But they never did. Because radiation doesn't just kill people, it kills places. In the first weeks, the streets still felt warm. Radios played in empty apartments. Elevators hummed between floors. But as the weeks became months, the silence settled in. Paint peeled, windows cracked, trees pushed up through sidewalks. Nature moved in like a squatter. The amusement park never opened. It had been scheduled to launch for May Day. The Ferris wheel was brand new. The bumper cars still had that factory smell. But the rides never spun. No one ever screamed with laughter. Instead, they sat in rusted silence as radioactive dust gathered on their surfaces. The hospital? Still full of forgotten chaos. Uniforms dumped in the basement. Sheets stained with panic. The Geiger counter still blinks red if you stand too long near the fireman's boots. Decades later, researchers discovered that the clothing stored in the cellar of Hospital No. 126 was so radioactive, it would max out most modern detectors. Just being near it for 5 minutes could poison you. And the homes? Some are ransacked. Looters came early. Others are untouched, like someone just stepped out to buy bread. Family photos. Wedding dresses. Letters never sent. A birthday cake. Left in the oven. But the mold, the mildew, and the silence. They make it feel like time died there. You walk through a hallway and hear only your own footsteps. A curtain sways, though the window's been broken for years. You feel watched, but there's no one there, Even wildlife avoids the city center. The animals took over the forests, the outskirts, the farmland. But the heart of Pripyat? Too still, too hot, even for them. Some say the city is cursed. Others say it's holy ground consecrated. By suffering, sealed off by fear. A place where the line between living and dead gets blurry. But it's not just haunting because of what happened. It's haunting because of what didn't. No one came back. Not officially. Not to live. The government declared it uninhabitable. Set up checkpoints. Put up signs. Danger. Radiation. And then left it. And in that vacuum, myth grew. Tourists began to sneak in, at first illegally, then on guided trips. Photographers came. Documentarians. Urban explorers. Each tried to capture what was left. They found Pripyat frozen. Bicycles still leaned against stairwells. Coats hung by the door. Candy wrappers on the floor of the cinema. X-ray machines in clinics. Rusty swings that creaked in the wind. A piano with one working key. It all sits there. Not destroyed. Not preserved. Just stalled. Even the trees seem hesitant to reclaim the deepest parts of the city. Like they know something happened there. Something that shouldn't be disturbed. And through it all, the radiation lingers. Less than it was, but still enough. In the soil. In the dust. In the walls. If you touch the wrong railing, if you sit too long in the wrong chair, the silent poison enters you. Because Chernobyl didn't just create a ghost town. It created a monument to silence, to secrecy, to the cost of denial. And as the years passed, Pripyat became more than a ruin. It became a warning. But to understand why the reactor blew at all, why the entire disaster happened in the first place, we have to rewind. Back to the decision that triggered it. Back to the test. And back to the single most reckless idea in the history of nuclear energy. It started with a test no one wanted to run. A test that had already failed 3 times before. A test designed to prove that Reactor 4 could survive a power outage, that the turbines could keep spinning long enough to power emergency systems in case of disaster. Irony doesn't even begin to cover it. April 25, 1986. Reactor 4 was scheduled for a shutdown. Not because of a malfunction, but for maintenance. That made it the perfect time, officials thought, to run this last little safety experiment. Turbine coast down test. On paper, it sounded simple. Turn off the power. Let the steam turbines spin down. See if they can generate enough electricity in that final minute to keep the coolant system running before backup diesel generators kick in. Sounds harmless, right? Except nothing about Chernobyl's RBMK reactors was harmless. These reactors had a design flaw, a terrifying one. At low power, they became unstable. Neutron spikes. Positive void coefficients. If none of that makes sense, all you need to know is this. They got more reactive when they should have been calming down. And no one had told the operators. Or at least, not in plain enough terms for them to understand just how dangerous that could be. So the test was scheduled. The plan was made. But then a delay. A power station in Kiev went down. Regional officials asked the Chernobyl crew to postpone the test for 10 hours. No one wanted to be responsible for knocking more power off the grid. And so, Reactor 4 was held at partial power node shutdown. Not fully active, just humming there, in this awkward, unstable middle state. By the time the test was greenlit again, it was nearly midnight. The day shift was gone. The experienced operators had gone home. The night crew, tired, young, undertrained, was now in charge of one of the most dangerous machines in the world. And they had orders to run the test. The reactor had already cooled down too far. When they tried to bring it back up, the power stalled at near zero levels. That's dangerous. At that point, the reactor behaves unpredictably. The operators knew that. So what did they do? They disabled the automatic safety systems. They pulled out too many control rods, the graphite-tipped rods meant to slow down the reaction. The reactor was now at a low, unstable power level, and they'd crippled its ability to correct itself. Then came the actual test. They cut power to the turbines. As they coasted down, coolant flow dropped. Water began turning to steam. In an RBMK reactor, steam isn't your friend. It means more reactivity, more neutrons bouncing around. The power begins to rise too fast. Now the operators panic. They hit the emergency shutdown button AZ5. It's supposed to kill the reaction. But here's the cruel twist. It does the opposite. Because of a flaw in the reactor design, the graphite tips on the control rods actually increase reactivity. For the first few seconds when inserted, in that brief window, the core surges out of control. The reactor spikes to over 30,000 megawatts, about 10 times its maximum. Fuel rods shatter. Cooling channels explode. The core fragments. Pressure builds. And then, boom. The first explosion tears the reactor open. A few seconds later, a second blast more powerful lifts the 1,000-ton reactor lid like it's made of cardboard. A fireball shoots into the night sky. Graphite ignites. Uranium fuel scatters across the roof. Radiation pours out like smoke from a dragon's mouth. And inside the control room, no one even knows what's happened. Their instruments are useless. The core is gone. The room fills with dust and panic. All for a test that wasn't supposed to happen that night. All because someone didn't want to look weak. All because safety came second to scheduling. In the days that followed, officials would argue over who was to blame. The operators? The managers? The designers? The party? The answer is yes, everyone was responsible. And yet, in true Soviet fashion, only a few would be punished. The rest would disappear into committee meetings, memos, and memorial plaques. But the damage was already done. And now, with the test behind them, the real nightmare began. Because the explosion didn't just damage the plant, it cracked the sky open and rained death all over the forests. Imagine you're standing on top of a nuclear reactor, except the reactor isn't humming quietly beneath your feet. It's been turned inside out. Its guts are exposed. The core is missing, scattered across rooftops and splattered on the ground. Like glowing coals. The building looks like it's been hit by a bomb. In many ways, it has. And now, something even worse starts to happen. The fire that followed the explosion wasn't just any fire. It was a graphite fire. Most reactors in the world were built with heavy shielding steel casings, concrete domes designed to contain radioactive material in case of accidents. But not Chernobyl. The RBMK design had no such containment structure. It was built to be cheaper, lighter, simpler to construct. But that simplicity meant death could escape easily. And when the graphite that surrounded the uranium fuel caught fire, it didn't just burn, it launched radioactive isotopes directly into the atmosphere. This wasn't smoke. It was ionized ash, bits of fuel, molten reactor core particles. Strontium, cesium, iodine, plutonium, all invisible to the eye, but more deadly than any bullet. And they were being carried by the wind. You couldn't smell it, you couldn't see it, but it was there, rising in a column miles high, spreading east, west, north, south. The Soviets tried to keep it quiet, but the wind didn't care about borders. Within 36 hours, the cloud passed over Belarus. By day 3, it was over Poland. By day 4, Sweden's nuclear sensors lit up like Christmas trees. Finland, Norway, Germany, France, even as far as the UK, all recorded heightened radiation levels. The wind didn't discriminate. It blew death across farms, cities, rivers, and fields. It settled on wheat in the north, on lakes in Scandinavia, on mountain passes in Austria. Children played in schoolyards as radioactive dust floated down. Like harmless pollen, fishermen cast nets into rivers laced with invisible danger, and no one had been warned. Meanwhile, back at the reactor, the fire kept burning. Day after day, night after night, the glowing wreckage beneath the collapsed lid of Reactor 4 continued to smolder, fueled by heat from the still active fuel and the oxygen-rich air it was never supposed to be exposed to. Radiation wasn't just leaking, it was gushing. Some estimates say the fire released 400 times more radioactive material than the Hiroshima bomb. The worst part? No one knew how to stop it. Every attempt was improvised, desperate. Drop sand from helicopters, drop clay, lead, boron, dolomite, anything to cool it down, suppress the fire, and absorb neutrons. But the fire wasn't just above. Ground. The molten remains of the core were melting down into the structure itself, eating through steel and concrete, moving slowly downward. If it reached the water table below, it could trigger a second explosion, a steam blast that would dwarf the first and poison half of Europe in a matter of hours. That wasn't just a theory. That was a real possibility. So Soviet scientists and military engineers scrambled to act. They decided to drain the water beneath the reactor and build a heat exchanger under the core. That meant sending workers into the wreckage, into the darkness, into the radioactive floodwater under the building. The firefighters were still trying to extinguish surface blazes, but these men were diving into liquid death. They weren't told the full truth. They were handed flashlights, maps, and boots, told the mission was critical, told they'd be honored. They weren't told their boots might melt, that their suits wouldn't stop the gamma rays, that the walls were steaming with radiation. But they went anyway, because if they didn't, millions more could die. Back on the surface, the fire continued. To breathe, to exhale, to radiate. Every moment it remained, the disaster deepened. The forest nearby turned red. The birds vanished. The animals grew sick. The soil burned sterile. And the air, it spread it all. Radiation rides dust particles. It floats on heat currents. It clings to the wet insides of clouds. When those clouds drifted into Belarus and Poland and Austria and Italy, they didn't just bring rain. They brought fallout. You might be eating breakfast in Munich when it arrives. You might be drinking milk in Krakow. You might be hiking in the Carpathians. And with every breath, it enters you. Not enough to drop you where you stand. Just enough to settle into your cells, your bones, your blood. Some call it the silent storm. Others call it the invisible plague. But it didn't stop with the air, because once the soil was poisoned, once the rivers were tainted, once the milk was spiked, the people who stayed would keep absorbing the damage for years, even after the fire finally went out, even after the cameras turned away, even after the headlines faded, because radiation doesn't check the news, and it doesn't go away. But to fight the fire from below, the Soviet Union called in a new group of men, the miners. And what those miners were asked to do bordered on insanity. You're 25 years old, a coal miner, born with soot in your lungs and calluses so deep they don't bleed when they split. You're proud of your work. You know what a bad day underground feels like: cave-ins, gas leaks, broken drills. But nothing prepares you for what comes next. One morning, the door swings open. A man in uniform enters the mine. No warning, no explanation, just orders. You're needed at Chernobyl. You and 400 others are loaded onto trains and buses. No one tells you why. No one tells you what happened. But rumors swirl an explosion, a fire, something with the nuclear plant. You've never been near a reactor in your life. You're a miner. You move coal. That's it. Until now. When you arrive, it hits you like a fist. The plant looks like a war zone. Smoke still curls from the broken reactor. Military trucks line. The roads. Helicopters hover overhead. Everyone's in masks. The air smells. Wrong. Burnt metal, ozone, concrete, dust. Then you get your assignment. Dig a tunnel underneath the burning core. Why? Because the molten fuel now, a radioactive lava known as corium, is melting through the foundation. If it reaches the water reservoirs, underneath it could trigger a second explosion, one that would make the first look like a hiccup. Scientists estimate it could wipe out Kiev and contaminate half of Europe for generations. So your job is simple. Get under it first. You're to dig a tunnel to install a heat exchanger, a cooling system to freeze the soil and stop the core from reaching the groundwater. Only there's a problem. It's hot. Not just warm, not just uncomfortable. It's so hot, the rubber in your boots starts to soften. The air in the shaft tastes like tin. Your tools burn your hands through the gloves. The deeper you dig, the worse it gets. The closer to the core, the thicker the air becomes. You're told the temperature underground it's 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That's before you factor in the radiation. So what do? You strip, completely, naked, except for helmets and boots. You dig like your life depends on it, because it does. You work in shifts, 2 hours at a time. One crew digs, the other rests, drinking warm water and smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. There's no ventilation system, no proper lighting. You use flood lamps and flashlights, and the occasional candle jammed into a crack in the wall. The tunnel is narrow, claustrophobic, barely enough room to swing a pick. And above you, a burning nuclear reactor, screaming with heat, dripping radiation. One man passes out mid-shift. They carry him out, unconscious. Another vomits into the wall, wipes his mouth, and keeps going. Some develop fevers within days, skin rashes, bloody noses, coughs that never stop. But they keep digging, because they were told millions would die if they failed. And they believed. The tunnel takes nearly 3 weeks to complete. Nearly 600 meters, dug by hand. When it's done, it curves underneath the melted core. The plan to install the heat exchanger is already in motion. Then, a twist. By the time the tunnel is finished, the risk of a second explosion has lessened. The groundwater has been drained. The soil is drier. The core is cooling very slowly, but enough that a full meltdown into the water table is no longer imminent. So they cancel the exchanger. The system you bled for? The one you risked cancer and death and heat stroke to build? It's never used. No one apologizes. You're given a handshake, a medal, maybe a bottle of vodka, then you're sent home. Some of you are dead within 5 years. Throat cancer, blood cancer, strange neurological conditions, tumors that doctors can't explain. Others survive, but never fully. You lose teeth. Your bones ache. Your skin peels in summer. You start forgetting things, your children's names, how to tie knots, what day it is. They write your story in the papers once, and never again. But those who dug the tunnel remember. They remember the heat, the pressure, the silence, and the lies. And yet there's no regret. One miner put it best years later. We knew what we were doing. We knew the risk. But we weren't going to let that thing take the whole world down with it. They were the last line. And for once, they held. But the reactor wasn't finished. Even when the fires were out, even when the core stopped melting, it kept breathing poison. And for the next 10 days, it would smolder quietly, invisibly, fatally. The fire may have stopped roaring, but the beast wasn't dead. It was just getting comfortable. Deep beneath the rubble of Reactor 4, the molten heart of the core continued to smolder. The air above it shimmered with heat. The concrete cracked and curled. The ground pulsed with invisible fury. It wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't dramatic, but it was still leaking death. For 10 days, the remains of the reactor, what was left of the uranium fuel, the graphite, the metal cladding slowly, burned like a buried coal seam. And with every passing hour, it released more radioactive isotopes into the world. The fire wasn't flames. It was a chemical heat, sustained by the mass of hot nuclear material that had pooled together and fused into something new. A material, later nicknamed the elephant's foot. You can still see photos of it. A grotesque, glassy mass wrinkled, molten, solidified mid-drip. It sat in a maintenance area beneath the core, emitting enough radiation in the beginning to kill a person in less than a minute. When scientists first tried to photograph it, their cameras melted. Their film turned black. Their equipment failed just by being nearby. And while that thing smoldered, it kept exhaling radioactive breath into the plant, into the air, soil. They tried everything to seal it. Sand, clay, boron, dolomite dropped from helicopters, lead sheeting, concrete capping. None of it was fast enough or thick enough to trap the worst of it. The radiation kept escaping. The half-lives of the materials being released weren't measured in days or weeks. They were measured in decades, centuries, even millennia. And all around it, people still worked. The plant wasn't abandoned yet. Incredibly, Reactor 3 directly, next to the destroyed Reactor 4, was still running. That's right. The Soviets decided to keep operating the other reactors at Chernobyl, even after one of them had exploded and poisoned half of Europe. Why? Because energy had to keep flowing. The grid still needed power. There were quotas to meet. And shutting down the plant entirely would mean admitting it was finished. And that was unthinkable. So people came to work. They clocked in, walked past the ruins of Reactor 4. Some were given flimsy masks. Some weren't. They were told, just don't. Stay near the western wall too long. That was the hot side, the side that faced the breach. The smoke had faded, but the heat was still there. The sensors on the roof read levels too high for standard instruments. Inside the halls, dust swirled with particles that could nest in your lungs and never leave. The engineers tried to calculate the decay heat. How long until the reactor cooled? When would it stop leaking? But no one could agree. The data was incomplete, the radiation patterns unpredictable. And the worst part? They couldn't even see the reactor anymore. It was gone, replaced by a pile of debris, molten metal, and radioactive sludge. No cameras, no readings, just guesses. And every now and then, a new steam plume would rise, evidence that deep within, the corium was still reacting with water, still alive. Some scientists feared a second explosion. If water pooled underneath the corium mass again, it could flash to steam and trigger another blast. Not as large as the first, but enough to scatter radioactive waste across the region all over again. So they kept monitoring, kept digging, kept praying. And the people living hundreds of kilometers away? They were told, the fire is out. Everything is under control. But milk still tasted metallic. Mushrooms still made Geiger counters scream. Children still developed fevers and fatigue. Farmers watched calves born with 2 heads. Beekeepers opened hives to find dead colonies. And yet the fire smoldered on. Finally, after 10 days of ceaseless burning, buried beneath sand and steel and desperation, the heat began to drop. The smolder slowed. The reaction settled. But the damage had already been done. 30 to 60% of the reactor's radioactive core had been released into the environment. Much of it traveled through wind and water, but some remained locked inside the skeleton of Reactor 4, pulsing faintly, like an ember that never fully dies. So they built a tomb. The sarcophagus, a massive steel and concrete shell, erected over the remains of Reactor 4 to contain the beast. It was rushed, sloppy, improvised, held together with bolts and hope, but it was all they could do. And inside that tomb, the reactor still breathes, even now. But before that sarcophagus could be completed, something else had to be done. Because the real danger was spreading quietly, invisibly, from the sky. And when it came down with the rain, it changed the land forever. You hear thunder in the distance. The sky turns a sickly gray. It's late April, but it feels like summer-thick, wet air that clings to your skin. A few fat drops hit the ground. You smile. The crops have been thirsty, but this is no ordinary rain. This is black rain. The radioactive plume from Chernobyl had reached high into the atmosphere, carried by thermal currents and shifting winds. It didn't travel like a smoke trail. It traveled like a ghost, invisible, unbound, drifting across borders, across oceans. And when it finally mixed with cold fronts and water vapor, it fell. People all over Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and beyond reported the same thing. Sudden rainstorms that came out of nowhere, left brown stains on the walls, and carried a strange, chemical smell. Some said it made their skin sting. Others said it tasted like rust. Children played in it. Farmers worked through it. No one had been told to stay indoors. In Sweden, reindeer herders noticed their livestock refusing to graze. In Austria, sheep gave birth to stillborn lambs. In the Alps, entire patches of snow turned yellow and brown. The fallout that came down with the rain carried iodine 131, cesium 137, strontium 90, and even plutonium, all particles that mimic natural elements. Inside the body, iodine goes to your thyroid. Cesium acts like potassium, slipping into your muscles. Strontium pretends to be calcium, nesting deep in your bones. You don't feel it at first. You're just wet. Maybe you get a headache. Maybe you cough. Maybe you notice your mouth tastes strange. Again, but the damage is already done. The worst hit areas weren't even close to the reactor. The rain didn't care about logic. One village, 400 kilometers away, received more fallout than some neighborhoods. Next to Pripyat, another town in Belarus, untouched by the initial plume, got a direct hit from a radioactive downpour. The people there didn't even know there had been an accident. They learned the hard way. Children developed thyroid issues first. Coughing, fatigue, weight loss, then lumps and surgeries. Farmers noticed that their milk turned sour faster. Their soil stopped growing properly. Mushrooms gathered in forests clicked like crazy under Geiger counters. But the government told them, keep harvesting. Do not waste food. In parts of Germany, radiation levels spiked in the Black Forest. In Wales, sheep had to be slaughtered by the thousands. In Italy, vegetable markets cleared out overnight. Fear traveled faster than the fallout, but not by much. And the Soviets? They still said nothing. They downplayed the cloud, denied the rain, accused Western nations of spreading hysteria. They claimed the reactor had released only a small amount of radioactive material. They insisted that any illnesses were psychosomatic. Mass radiation phobia, they called it. But the evidence puddled at their feet. Scientists in Vienna tracked the cloud using weather models. Independent labs collected rainwater in jars and recorded levels, high enough to trigger emergency shutdowns if it had been discovered sooner. But by then, the rain had fallen, and radiation doesn't wash off. especially not from soil. Once the fallout hit the ground, it bonded to the dirt, to the leaves, to the skin of apples and the roots of dandelions. It seeped into rivers and lakes. It made its way into wells and reservoirs. In some places, farmers tried to plow deeper, bury the contaminated topsoil under a fresh layer. Others were told to use clean water to rinse their crops. But how could you rinse something that's already soaked into the roots? So they bulldozed entire fields. They raised orchards. In Ukraine and Belarus, whole villages were liquidated, bulldozed into the ground like the Red Forest. Not because of the blast, but because of the rain. And in the cities, fear began to rise. You'd wash your hands 10 times a day, scrub your shoes, stop letting your kids play outside. But it didn't matter. If the rain hit your home, your street, your food supply, you were already marked. And the thing is, you could never be sure, because the rain didn't look evil. It didn't glow green. It didn't hiss or bubble. It was just rain, maybe a little sticky, maybe a little off-smelling, but just rain. And that's what made it so terrifying. You could be poisoned without even knowing. And some of the people who tried to clean it up, to wash the streets, scrub the walls, decontaminate the soil, would find out the hard way that radiation isn't a stain you can scrub out. But they tried anyway, with brooms, with water trucks, with fire hoses. They sprayed down entire cities and thought it would be enough. But it wasn't, because radiation doesn't disappear. It just hides. And when those cleanup efforts started to fall apart, the cover-up began to collapse with them. You've been assigned to cleanup duty, not at the plant, not in the Red Forest, just in your city, on the streets, the walls, the playgrounds, the places where people lived their lives. You're handed a broom, a rag, a hose. They tell you to start scrubbing. You're told this will help decontaminate the area, wash the fallout off the pavement, rinse the radiation from the rooftops. Just water and elbow grease. No hazmat suits, no respirators, just a bucket and hope. And so you get to work. You sweep dust from the streets of Gomel. You spray sidewalks in Kiev. You wash buses and apartment windows and children's statues. In one neighborhood, a group of soldiers is assigned to hose down a kindergarten. The swings, the slides, sandboxes. It's the definition of a losing battle. Because radiation isn't like dirt. You can't mop it up and squeeze it into a bucket. Cesium-137 doesn't rinse off with warm water and a rag. It binds to everything metal, paint, concrete. You can wash the surface, but the poison stays underneath. And the people giving orders? They know this. But the cleanup isn't about safety anymore. It's about appearances. The Soviet leadership wants to present a picture of calm. Streets must be cleaned, buildings scrubbed, vehicles hosed down and returned to duty. It's all part of the image. We are in control. The crisis is over, so you keep scrubbing. Your back aches. Your fingers crack and bleed. Your boots stick to puddles of radioactive runoff. You don't know how many rads are soaking into your skin every hour, but the headaches have started again. That metallic taste is back, and your nose won't stop bleeding. You're not alone. Thousands are doing this. Volunteers, drafted civilians, even school teachers, truck drivers, college students. They were told to do their part, to clean up, to restore order. In one district, workers are ordered to scrape the topsoil off every square meter of public land. Parks, yards, school fields. The dirt is bulldozed into pits and covered with lime. But some of those pits are never marked. Years later, children would play over them, unaware of what slept just beneath their feet. Inside buildings, the cleanup gets stranger. Contaminated furniture is burned. Wallpaper is stripped. Entire stairwells are repainted, not because it helps, but because the old paint holds fallout like a sponge. Some walls are simply torn down. Hospitals are the worst. At Hospital No. 126 in Pripyat, workers were ordered to clean the floor tiles in the emergency ward. But the patients who had been there, the firefighters, the plant workers, they had left behind radiation burns that etched into the walls. The tiles were ripped out and buried in lead containers. Their uniforms? So radioactive that even now, decades later, they still sit in the basement of that hospital, untouched, untouchable. And then there's the equipment, the trucks, the helicopters. The buses used to evacuate Pripyat. All of them became radioactive. Some were buried. Others were parked in long rows in vehicle graveyards. Locals call them the metal cemeteries. A few were even sold for parts, despite being hot with radiation. The parts showed up in other cities, in factories, in cars. You might have bought a second-hand truck in 1992 and never known it once carried contaminated children out of the zone. And still, the cleanup continued. In the villages that couldn't be saved, they resorted to liquidation. Homes were bulldozed, entire streets erased. People were told to walk away from their lives, to leave everything behind. If they resisted, soldiers came in and emptied the houses by force. Beds, stoves, books, clothes, everything thrown into trenches and burned. And the people? They were relocated, quietly, with no compensation, no warning. One day you're feeding chickens in your backyard. The next, a soldier tells you it's time to leave. You ask why. He doesn't answer. You grab what you can carry. Then you watch a bulldozer flatten the house you were born in. But even with all this effort, even with all the hosing and burying and scrubbing, the radiation remained. It seeped into the bones of the land. And the government began to realize they couldn't wash this away. And when the truth started leaking out, when scientists began to speak and international observers asked questions, the system cracked. Because even in the Soviet Union, some lies couldn't hold. And the people who dared to speak up, they paid a price. But even silence wouldn't stop the sickness that was now growing in the blood and bones of tens of thousands. There's a phrase people whispered quietly in the months after the disaster. They bricked them in. At first, it sounded like myth, a rumor whispered among nurses, echoed by relatives standing outside sealed hospital doors. But it was rooted in something disturbingly real. Some victims of the Chernobyl disaster were too radioactive to bury. They couldn't be placed in wooden coffins, or held in funeral homes, or laid to rest in traditional cemeteries. Their bodies, still emitting gamma rays, would poison anyone who stood too close for too long. So the Soviet state devised another method. They buried them like waste. The first to go this way were the firefighters, the men who had arrived first, who picked up burning graphite with bare hands, who stood on the roof in the smoke. They were taken to Moscow's Hospital No. 6. There, in a sealed, heavily monitored wing, they spent their final days melting from the inside out. Their skin blistered, their lungs hemorrhaged, their muscles failed. Some died conscious. Some begged to be sedated. Their bedsheets were changed constantly. Their nurses wore 3 layers of gloves. Everything that touched them, blankets, clothing, 4 tubing, was incinerated after use. When they died, their bodies were wrapped in plastic, then placed inside sealed zinc coffins. The zinc wasn't symbolic. It was shielding. Even in death, they were dangerous. At the cemetery in Moscow, the burial was conducted at night. Quiet, no family allowed close. The coffins were lowered into deep concrete vaults and then entombed in cement. Literally bricked in. Not a grave, a sarcophagus. And it wasn't just A handful. More and more followed. Plant workers who returned to the core. Liquidators who received too high a dose. Soldiers who bulldozed hot zones. Their bodies were treated not like humans, but like reactive material. Some funerals were public. Open caskets, flowers, speeches. But the casket wasn't real. It was ceremonial. The actual body was underground, cemented shut, deep in a controlled burial zone. The families weren't told the truth. Some were handed death certificates listing heart failure or lung disease. Some were allowed to view the remains through thick glass while wearing protective clothing. Others were told nothing at all, just handed a medal and a sealed folder. And then came the hospitals themselves. Doctors and nurses who cared for the first wave of radiation victims began to fall ill. One nurse who had changed the bandages of a firefighter noticed her gums bleeding days later. Another, who handled 4 drips with minimal protection, developed chronic fatigue and rashes. The state discouraged them from speaking publicly. They were told it was stress, that they were imagining it, that they were being unpatriotic. Some quit. Others kept working, hoping their sacrifice would matter. It did, but the cost was their health. And what about the bodies that weren't bricked in? Some were cremated, but that brought its own problems. Cremation releases particles into the air. Ashes had to be handled like chemical waste. Some crematorium workers refused to do it without additional protection. Others weren't told what they were dealing with. A few bodies, still hot with radiation, were buried in unmarked graves. The record-keeping wasn't perfect. In the chaos of the early days, some names were lost, some tags misplaced. Entire cemeteries later had to be tested with Geiger counters, just to identify where the radiation was strongest. In Belarus, one burial crew reportedly wore full suits and masks, but weren't given enough gloves. They worked through the night, digging fast, coughing the whole time. Only later did they find out the bodies they were handling had been exposed to core material. Years later, many of those same gravediggers suffered from thyroid cancer and leukemia. The fear of the bodies never really went away. Decades after the disaster, the cemetery in Moscow where the firefighters were buried is still considered special. Visitors are warned not to linger too long. The ground above those zinc coffins still hums faintly with radiation. And the phrase bricked in, it became more than a rumor. It became a symbol, not just of death, but of how the Soviet system dealt with death quietly, forcefully, and out of sight. It wasn't enough for the victims to die. Their stories had to be sealed too, buried beneath concrete, silenced beneath medals and propaganda. But not everyone stayed silent. Some within the Soviet Union began to ask why this had happened, why the warnings had been ignored, why the design flaws were hidden, why the people weren't told. And that truth, the one hidden beneath all the lies and funerals and concrete walls, would eventually reach the very top of the Soviet government and reveal just how many people in power had known more than they ever admitted. He was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, and he didn't find out until it was already too late. Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party, was awakened on the morning of April 26, 1986, by a brief message. There has been a fire at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. The situation is under control. That was it. No mention of an explosion. No word of radiation. No hint that one of the most catastrophic industrial accidents in history had just occurred under his watch. For nearly 24 hours, Gorbachev remained in the dark. It wasn't until radiation levels in Sweden spiked and foreign governments started demanding answers that the real story reached his desk. And even then, it was partial, watered down, carefully worded. But when he saw the numbers, he read the dosimeter readings and the damage reports, he froze. Because this wasn't just a fire. This was a disaster with no precedent. A meltdown, an explosion, an invisible monster creeping across Europe. And the leaders beneath him, the ministries, the KGB, the plant directors, they had all waited before saying a word. Why? Because in the USSR, truth moved up the ladder slowly, and sometimes not at all. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. No one wanted to admit a failure of Soviet technology, of Soviet leadership, of Soviet planning. So they withheld, delayed, filtered. And Gorbachev, despite being the top man, had been left out of the loop. When he finally learned the truth, he was furious. Not just because of the disaster, but because of the lies surrounding it. Lies from his own people. On April 28th, 2 full days later, the Soviet Union made its first public announcement about Chernobyl. Just one sentence. No details, no casualty figures, no acknowledgement of danger. By then, radioactive clouds had reached Finland, Norway, and Germany, and the world was watching. Gorbachev scrambled to contain the fallout, political and literal. He ordered evacuations. He sent in the military. He dispatched experts to assess the damage. He formed commissions. But the truth was already out, and the cracks in the Soviet system were showing. Internally, there was chaos. Ministers fought over who was responsible. KGB reports contradicted official statements. Engineers denied wrongdoing. Military commanders refused to accept blame for failed containment. But buried in all of it was one unavoidable fact. The reactor design was deeply flawed. The RBMK reactor had a known instability at low power, a design flaw that engineers had raised years earlier. But the warnings were ignored. Reports were buried. Updates were postponed. Because fixing the problem would mean slowing construction. Admitting errors and spending money the state didn't want to spend, so they said nothing. And now the cost was being paid in human lives. Gorbachev had come to power promising reform, glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. He wanted a smarter, leaner Soviet Union. But Chernobyl showed him the system he inherited was built on secrecy, fear, and denial. He later admitted that Chernobyl did more to unravel the Soviet Union than any political reform or protest. The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. But in the days following the disaster, he couldn't say that. He still had to play the part. He addressed the nation 3 weeks after the explosion on television in a carefully scripted broadcast. He called it a tragedy. He praised the workers and firefighters. He promised safety and transparency. But he didn't say how close the world had come to a second explosion. He didn't mention the real death toll. He didn't say how long the radiation would linger. Because the truth, even now, was still too dangerous to speak plainly. And while Gorbachev battled the fallout in Moscow, the people in the exclusion zone battled something else. Displacement. Entire communities were now in limbo. No homes. Number. Belongings. No answers. They were told to pack for 3 days. It would become forever. It starts with a knock. You open the door, and a soldier is standing there. Mask, rifle, clipboard. You have 2 hours. Pack essentials. Leave everything else. Transportation is waiting. No explanation. No questions allowed. You grab a bag. Some clothes. Your papers. You forget your toothbrush. You forget the photo albums. You tell your son to grab his shoes, and he grabs the wrong pair. You tell your daughter to leave her stuffed bear behind. You'll be back soon. That's what they tell you. It's just precautionary. A short relocation. They don't say where you're going. They don't say how long you'll be gone. They don't say your town is about to be turned into a radioactive grave. You board the bus with your neighbors. Some are crying. Some are silent. One man clutches a small radio. Another holds a kitten in his coat. The roads are lined with checkpoints. Soldiers wave you through, stone-faced. The further you get, the more the scenery changes. Fields, then fences, then barbed wire. You're taken to a settlement outside the zone. A cluster of temporary buildings, plywood walls, tin roofs, military tents. They call it a relocation center, but it feels more like a refugee camp. There's no privacy, no supplies, no answers. The next day, you're told to register. With local authorities, they assign you a room. Maybe 2 rooms if you have children. You're handed ration cards, a cup of tea, a number. You're not a citizen anymore. You're an evacuee. And you're not alone. Over the following months, more than 300,000 people would be forcibly relocated from the Chernobyl exclusion zone and surrounding areas. Entire villages emptied, towns dissolved. One by one, communities that had existed for generations were pulled from the map. Some went quietly, others resisted. In one village, elders refused to leave. They locked their doors and told the soldiers to go to hell. They said, "We were born here. We'll die here." And many of them did. In another, a group of mothers begged to return. Their children weren't eating. They were getting sick in the crowded shelters. But the homes they'd left behind were now guarded by troops. Windows smashed, dogs shot, fruit trees withering under a haze of cesium. And still, the people asked, "When can we go back?" The answer changed with every season. First, it was 3 days, then a few weeks, then never. And the homes they left behind, bulldozed, buried, burned. Some were marked for liquidation. Buildings with high radiation were destroyed entirely. Others were looted by opportunists, by soldiers, by anyone with a Geiger counter and no conscience. But the possessions didn't just disappear. They spread. One man's sofa ends up in a shop 200 kilometers away. A child's toy, still hot with isotopes, gets resold in a market in Minsk. A shipment of lumber from a restricted village ends up in a new housing project in a different republic. Contamination wasn't just a hazard. It was now a commodity. And the relocated families? They weren't always welcomed. Locals saw them as diseased, unlucky, cursed. Children were bullied in schools. Mothers were whispered about at markets. "They're from Chernobyl," people said. "Don't get too close." Some landlords refused to rent to them. Some employers turned them away. You feel like a ghost, a citizen without a city, a mother without a kitchen, a father without a job. Your life, frozen in April, now scattered across a gray zone of bureaucracy, waiting lists, and silence. You're told to settle, to adapt. But how do you rebuild a life that was erased overnight? How do you explain to your child why they can't go back and feed their dog? Why their grandmother's house was buried under dirt? Why their school books were burned? The state gives you a new address, a new job, a new place in line, but they can't give you back what you lost. Because what you lost wasn't just a home. It was normalcy. It was certainty. It was the feeling that you understood the world around you. And the cost of that loss? It wouldn't just be paid by you. It would be paid in full by the doctors and nurses now watching an entire generation of children fall sick, one by one. The first wave was easy to explain. Burns, vomiting, bleeding, hair loss. You didn't need a medical degree to recognize acute radiation syndrome. The symptoms were horrific, but expected. The patients? Mostly firefighters, plant workers, soldiers people, who had been there, who had touched the reactor with their own hands, who had stood in the smoke and rubble and ash. But then came the second wave. Children, dozens, then hundreds, from areas far beyond Pripyat. kids who had never even seen the plant. They arrived at hospitals across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia with complaints too vague to raise alarms. First, fatigue, sore throats, fevers, swollen glands. A few had nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. Others had dry, cracking skin. And then, one by one, the lumps appeared. Thyroid nodules, enlarged lymph nodes, abnormal masses growing in small, delicate necks. At first, doctors suspected infections, maybe viruses. But biopsies came back with worse news: thyroid cancer. In children, it was rare. So rare that most hospitals saw just a handful of pediatric thyroid cases in a decade. But now, some clinics were seeing dozens in a single month. Surgeons began to operate around the clock, slicing into necks that should never have needed a scalpel. They removed entire glands, inserted drains, fused nerves. The children woke up with bandages and stitches running across their throats. Some survived, others didn't. The ones who did would be on hormone therapy for life. A few had their voices permanently damaged. And the wave didn't stop. Cases continued to rise. Not just thyroid cancer, but leukemia, lymphoma, and rare tumors doctors didn't even have names for. One boy was diagnosed with 2 types of cancer simultaneously. Another girl's white blood cell count dropped so low, her body stopped healing entirely. Still, the state denied it. Officials claimed there was no provable link to Chernobyl, that the radiation doses in affected regions were within acceptable limits, that the illnesses were caused by stress, poor hygiene, even malnutrition. But the doctors knew better. They started keeping secret records, handwritten logs, hidden x-rays, quiet conversations in hallways. They shared notes with colleagues across the region. They compared tumor shapes, blood results, radiation exposure maps. A pattern emerged clear, undeniable, and damning. And it wasn't just children. Young women began to miscarry at alarming rates. Some babies were born with organ deformities, missing limbs, brains that didn't develop. Others died within days of birth. The cause was never officially recorded as radiation, just natural causes, or worse, unknown. Doctors were instructed not to ask questions, not to speak to journalists, not to publish findings without party approval. But a few brave ones did. One Belarusian pediatrician published a study on childhood cancers in the Gomo region then, lost his license, and disappeared. You walk into a hospital room. It's quiet. A child lies in the bed, pale, hooked to tubes. Their mother strokes their hair. The nurse checks vitals. In the corner, a doctor stands with arms folded, angry, exhausted, helpless, because this child didn't stand near the reactor, didn't eat radioactive mushrooms, didn't chase fire, trucks, or drink contaminated milk. They just lived, laughed, breathed, and now their body is collapsing under the weight of particles too small to see, too deadly to ignore. And these aren't isolated cases. In Belarus alone, childhood thyroid cancer increased by more than 1,000% in the years following the disaster. In Ukraine and Western Russia, the numbers spiked just as sharply. And across Europe, children exposed to even low doses of fallout showed subtle but disturbing effects: immune disorders, developmental delays, cognitive impairments. But none of this made the front page. It happened quietly, slowly, over years. Because unlike the first responders who died in days, these victims were forgotten in layers. Out of sight, out of the zone, out of mind. The doctors carried the weight. Some wrote memoirs years later, unable to hold it in. Others died of cancers themselves, exposed through years of treating irradiated patients without proper protection. The files they left behind told a story the government refused to publish. But the story couldn't be buried forever. Because radiation doesn't just mark the skin, it rewrites the blood. And the people affected by it would grow up changed. Some would survive. Some would speak out. And some would carry the fallout in their DNA. Not just for the rest of their lives, but into the lives of their children. Because Chernobyl didn't end in 1986. It simply entered the bloodstream of a generation. So now you know. The Chernobyl disaster wasn't just an explosion. It wasn't just a fire. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of silence, pride, denial, and fear that spiraled far beyond the blast zone. It poisoned the air, the earth, the water, and the people. It destroyed families. It erased entire towns. It melted steel and bone alike. But more than anything, it revealed something that couldn't be hidden behind walls or slogans. That a system built on secrets can't contain a force that doesn't care who's in charge. Radiation doesn't negotiate. It doesn't obey orders. It doesn't wait for committee approval. And in the days after April 26, 1986, it moved faster than lies ever could. The people who lived through it, those who dug tunnels naked under molten reactors, who evacuated with only a suitcase, who watched their children grow sick, carried more than radiation. They carried knowledge. They knew what had happened. They remembered the smells, the heat, the silence, the taste in their mouths. And they remembered the faces of the ones who said, "Everything is under control." The truth of Chernobyl leaked out just like the reactor core did. Slowly, relentlessly. Today, the sarcophagus still stands, now replaced by a massive steel arch that looms over. Reactor 4 like a tombstone too heavy to ignore. The city of Pripyat still sits in silence. The forests still whisper. And the wind still moves, slow, invisible, and full of memory. Because some disasters don't end when the fire goes out. Some disasters echo, and some never really leave.